Our second speaker for our series, Deep Roots, Wild Branches, is Diane Pollard. Diane is currently a member of the Reparations and Moses Commissions of the Diocese of New York. She's a member of the steering committee and treasurer of the newly established Episcopal Coalition for Racial Equity and Justice. Diane is currently involved in the Harlem congregations, where the congregations have been working on the re-envisioning of ministry and stewardship as it relates to our changing congregations. Now that's kind of the basic stuff. I want to share a little bit of the Diane that I got to know back in, 2017 maybe, when I was a seminarian at Church of the Heavenly Rest. And that summer I was going to start the Creative Arts Project. And Matt Hyde, our current bishop, suggested that I get in touch with this woman, Diane Pollard. Well, since then, Diane has been the voice in my ear, a confidant, a guide. She was at my ordination. She is someone that I look up to and admire in this diocese. The long-standing journey she's had in this diocese and the deep respect with which she receives from everyone she encounters. She is my co-conspirator, and I love our morning coffees at Cafe Amrita pretty regularly. We kind of live in the same neighborhood. So it is my joy and pleasure to welcome her. This is Diane Pollard. Please welcome her with me. You got it? If it's going to be solid enough.
That's what I mean. I'm using this because of past experience when you lean on these things, and then all of a sudden you find that you're down on the floor somewhere. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. Good morning. It is such a joy to be here with you all and to be with Leisha and to actually be around this neighborhood. A long time ago, back in 1994, I was trustee of the board of the General Seminary. So I was around here a lot, and it's interesting to see how neighborhoods change. Neighborhoods change, but they remain the same. People move in and people move out, but more often than not, the ones who move in are people who want to make that place a significant offering to those who live there. And so I'm just really happy to be here with you all and to get a chance to talk a little bit about, not so much about myself, but what I do, and hope to energize you and think about what you would like to do. We're all existing in extremely changing times. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but these days there are times that make me question so many of the assumptions about good and evil. And just to plainly doubt my own understanding about common decency and general love of one another. However, at the end of the day, I continue to believe that we are people of faith. We do care for each other, and outside evil pressures will not prevail over us or over our ministries. In trying to decide the passage I would use as a basis for my sermon today, it was no surprise to me that I continued to come to passages that focus on justice. I settled on Deuteronomy because not only is it basic, but it seems to me that it is so timely and relative to our world today. Deuteronomy 18 says the following: "Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you." This verse emphasized the importance of pursuing righteousness and fairness in order to to inherit and thrive in the promised land. It applies to all aspects of our lives, particularly in legal matters. The verse is part of a larger section of Deuteronomy that instructs the Israelites on appointing judges and officials in each town to ensure that impartial judgment for the people. It highlights that true justice, not bribery or favoritism, is essential to the well-being and prosperity of the community. In today's world, as a layperson, it is challenging for me. I see the daily savage and unkind actions that are intentionally being forced on our communities and people. The fear that they must go through each day simply to exist. However, if there is one thing that I am afraid of, it is the possibility that we as a church will do nothing. That's just not an option. I know the choices that we make in the form of responses must be carefully threaded, and needles must be carefully threaded. We are blessed to have a bishop who is a leader, a listener, and who is deeply spiritual, and who helps us make wise and thoughtful decisions about our ministries. Now, a little about my own journey in the Episcopal Church. Being anchored and transformed me, and where do I find myself continually saying yes to my faith these days? I start out as a child of two native New Yorkers. My mother migrated to New York as a teenager from Barbados, but she arrived in New York as a devotee of all things African American, immediately immersing herself in James Baldwin, Zora Neale Thurston, Malcolm X, and all the modern day prophets. She and my dad focused my two sisters and me on an inquisitiveness for history and the life of the African American diaspora. We attended an Anglo-Catholic church in Harlem. It was a strict place, grounded in many rules and regulations. I was a member of the choir and was involved in many of the activities that were common to Caribbean congregations. Around age 16, I became very disinterested in my church. I felt that my church was not active enough in the efforts of civil rights. I was completely immersed in civil rights. It did not seem to me as if my church was active and caring about the things I cared about. I volunteered with children in a number of outreach programs when not in school. The amazing thing to me was the fact that my parents did not tell me that I had to go back to church. They just waited and were supportive of what I was doing. And I guess they figured I would find my way. I think it was because of my parents' sensitivity to me that I just don't get excited when I hear people say that young people are not in church these days. I think that if we invite them, they will come. And if we welcome them, they will stay. And I remember the freedom that I was given when I was really perplexed about what I wanted to do. And it worked out, evidently, because I did come back to the church. In 1972, Paul Moore Jr. was elected Bishop of New York. He had been a suffragan bishop in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. After having served as a rector in many urban areas and in many social justice ministries. He came to New York and our diocese was reorganized into what we called inter-parish councils, with each IPC having about 10 congregations. We were encouraged to work, hoping to become an effective presence in poor communities. Harlem was a very different place. And for those of you who live there, and I've talked to some people who live there and live on the outskirts of Harlem, you can't imagine what it was like. It was a difficult time. Housing was very poor. Schools and education was not very good. And it was a time of volatility, but hope, because the folks there really wanted to make a change. They wanted to make a difference. And I think that having lived through that time, it fostered in me a kind of self-determination. And when that comes to not only communities, it comes to churches. You know, you're in a church, you want to make something happen, so do it. You know, just do it. Our urban cities were very underserved. And however, our churches became really involved in outreach. This is more like what I wanted to do. And I offered to serve as a volunteer communications person to the Manhattan North Inter-Parish Council, the churches in Harlem. Mind you now, I was still not going to church officially. At the same time, I met a priest who was on sabbatical working at a large outreach project called the Satellite Academies. The Satellite Academies, I think, became sort of a precursor to charter schools, because they were put together by neighborhood people. Now, I will say that the folks who put them together did not have all of the formal educations that you will find these days, but they had the right idea. This priest that I met was named John Coburn, and he had taken a sabbatical from his job as a rector in a very wealthy congregation in Boston, and had come to Harlem to work. He stayed for a year, and I met him when I was doing the communication in Harlem. He really encouraged me and pushed me around a lot. He said to me, you know, you really ought to be doing something different than writing a newspaper. And so he got me involved in different things. He was deeply involved in South Africa and in the divestment, and he knew Bishop Desmond Tutu, who I met later and became a close friend of. John was later elected the Bishop of Massachusetts, and until his death, I valued him as a close mentor and friend. My professional career started to advance, and I became an insurance underwriter and benefits analyst in Wall Street. I moved on to managing investment funds. I tell you this because there is ministry wherever we are. There is something to do, whether you're working in, no matter where you're working. If you're working in a kitchen, there's something to do. There is some kind of ministry that we as human beings can do to reach out to others. As a young professional layperson, I continued to be active in the church when I worked in Wall Street. I would attend services at Trinity Church, where I would continue my outreach and would later become church warden many years later and get into the involvement of some of the development in Lower Manhattan. I actually walked around this neighborhood when I got here early this morning looking at some of these buildings, and bells were ringing, you know, their names, and I see the community changing and how important that has been. I have been a lay volunteer all my life, with no aspiration to ordination, although lots of people have asked me about that. There are lots of people in the church who want to who wonder why I don't want to be ordained. I feel very strongly about the mission and the call of all people, deacon, lay, and priest. And I think that as we work together, it is a collective that can't fail. And I like to be a part of that collective of lay people. I value my opportunities as a member of the laity, and I hope you all do when you're called to do something. I really value my call because I think it gives me freedom as a lay minister to push back against systems that do not reflect God's call for a just society. In other words, I value my ability to be a pain when it's needed. And there are people who will attest that. Some examples of that, I chaired the Benefits Policy Committee of the Church Pension Fund as a trustee when we extended health insurance coverage to same-sex partners. This was before marriage equality, this was before all of that, but it was a groundbreaking thing that led the way to talk about marriage equality. I chaired the Joint Nominating Committee for the election of the presiding bishop when our church elected Catherine Jeffords Shorey as presiding bishop and primate. If you don't think that was hard in the kind of climate in the Anglican Church where women were not seen as a priest, much less the presiding bishop, you better think about that again. I believe to the extent that I have been of service to the wider church, it has been because of the movement of the Holy Spirit, and that I have simply been blessed because of God's gift to me to be a facilitator in the process. I see myself as no more than that. I've been passionate about many things in the church, but I started with my commitment to civil rights. I believe in the inclusion of all people, no exceptions. I have been blessed many times by this diocese to have been elected a deputy to our General Convention. The General Convention is made up of representatives from each diocese who meet every 3 years to work on church-wide legislation. It sounds boring, and it is. These resolutions then serve as mandates to what we're going to do here. So the resolutions that you get, they have come from this large body that have spent a lot of time debating and changing language, but what comes out is usually very important. In 2003, our church started dipping its toe into the conversation of slavery and reparations. We had not even started discussing the all-important conversation on white supremacy and reparations. My current passion actually started in 2005 as a deputy when I authored a resolution calling for the church to acknowledge its responsibility for the perpetuation of racism. As a result of the resolutions, conversations on becoming beloved community began. These conversations led to a 9-year study and work under the leadership of presiding Bishop Michael Curry, and changed our church. They really changed our church. They've been followed by many efforts, but it is far from over, and we've not even kind of tipped the edge of the iceberg. The conversations under the leadership of Bishop Hyde, our diocese continues to look at hard threads of our history as a church and as a nation. Mind you, we are in a time of challenge, a time when it seems like these conversations are being obliterated, but they're not, because God is on the throne, and he's not going to let that happen. 2 years ago, our diocese approved the establishment of the Moses Commission. The Moses Commission, which I'm sure a lot of you know, Harriet Tubman was called Moses because she ran the Underground Railroad and brought people from the South to the North. And when the commission was sitting around trying to talk about what we wanted to call it, I said, well, we just can't call it something boring. We need to it has to be something that catches your eye. So I got on the internet and I started putting in things to see, because you don't want to take somebody else's name. And I put in Moses, and Harriet Tubman's name came up. And I said, well, why don't we try Moses? And so lots of other dioceses have been coming up with similar names. And I think that the decision of the commission to go along with that was very important. Moses Commission, you've seen lots of announcements about what we're doing. The commission is just being formed in the diocese here. It's a separate 501c3 organization, which is a good thing because it separates it from the other work, and it also engages people to come and be a part of that. Stay tuned, there's going to be a lot being announced about that within the coming months. These days, as Licia said, I spend a lot of my time working with congregations as they seek ways that we can retool our buildings and look at ways of doing ministry in new and different ways. Not throwing away the old, not telling people to go away, but looking at ways in which we can enhance some of the old practices and old structures. It's an interesting thing to know that there are probably only 3 congregations in our diocese that are actually ADA accessible. There are lots of places where people have tried, you put ramps in, but that ability to just walk into a church or wheel into a church does not exist. Now, the other thing that in my work these days that I say outside of my meetings, that we're afflicted with a lot of old buildings, many of which are landmarked. So when you go to try and make changes in a landmark building, you come away with a headache. I was walking around here and I saw the adjustments, and that's really great. But I think just around the neighborhood, and you see how there's a struggle to get around. At Heavenly Rest, I think, where I worship, I think quite accidentally, because of when the church was built, it's totally ADA accessible. You can walk right in off the street and walk right to the altar without going up a step. That's just because it's a church that wasn't built in the 1600s. It's in the upper part of Manhattan, although there are churches in the upper part of Manhattan that you can't get into either, so it's not really the time. I began this conversation talking about Deuteronomy 16. I go back to January 20th of this year, when my faith, like yours, started being really tested. Many of the important principles of church and society have been challenged, and many have been eliminated. The reminder that Deuteronomy gives us an absolute mandate of justice seems to have fallen on deaf ears. However, it is at times like this that I remember 2 of my personal prophets. The first one is a priest who died the last couple of years by the name of Canon Edward Rodman. I don't think that there are too many people in here who would know him. but he was a black priest who lived during the 60s, a very, very wise man who was admitted to seminary and med school at the same time and chose to go to seminary. He had served as a mentor to so many bishops and laity, and had just been a thoughtful person who listened, and he listened to me. He would always tell us, especially in the 60s when we had groups of people who would gather, that the one thing that we had to remember is that we should always remember to, quote, "Let there be peace among us, and let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression." In other words, we should never lose sight of working together for the cause. Those of us who came through the 60s and are still around never referred it to the 60s, we refer to it as the movement. And we do that because it was a time when we hoped we would move church and society. But we did it for all who needed support. My second prophet and dear friend was the Right Reverend Barbara Clementine Harris, the first woman ordained in the Anglican Communion as a bishop. Whenever things seemed to be difficult, Barbara would say, "Do not forget that we are Easter people living in a Good Friday world." Think about it. We are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. God does not give us more than we can handle. These comments are so true and timely for us as we strive for justice and peace. So we must press on in faith. Today's justice calls to memory the words of our Bible and the many prophets who have gone before. And in closing, let us never forget that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Amen. Oops, daisy.